one of us. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Erin Daly, and on behalf of myself and Jimmy May, I'd like to welcome you to this segment of the Good Legal Stories series, now in its second season. The Good Legal Stories series is a corollary to the Good Stories movement sponsored by the Normandy Chair for Peace, an endeavor based in France with international participation, whose motto is, "We will have peace on earth when we have peace with the earth." To that end, the Good Legal Stories series spotlights landmark environmental efforts from around the globe through the voices of those who worked on and decided the cases. Today, we're very excited that Alyn Ware, a world-renowned expert on peace and disarmament, will be speaking with us about his case before the ICJ against nuclear weapons. Jimmy will introduce Alyn.
Well, good afternoon and evening and morning, everybody. Let's tell you a little bit about Alyn. We're just so delighted that he's a part of this program. So Alyn Ware, as many of you may already know, he's a peace educator and international peace and disarmament campaigner. He's the co-founder and global coordinator for Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, Peace and Disarmament Programs Director for the World Future Council, and other organizations. So he previously served as executive director of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy and founded and directed the Mobile Peace Fan and other peace education initiatives. He's also one of the leaders of the successful campaigns to prohibit nuclear weapons from New Zealand in the 1980s and to achieve a ruling from the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, the subject of today's good legal story. Alyn, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Jimmy and Erin. Thank you so much for inviting me to the program. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Yes, my name's Alyn. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa is the indigenous name for our country, also one of the official names. And it's a great pleasure to be talking about the case we took to the International Court of Justice, the World Court against nuclear weapons. It was a big case. We had to fight against the nuclear armed states who are very, very powerful in the UN system to get to the court. We had to work very hard to win the case. And then we've been working on follow-up to it. But I'll go back to the beginning. Where did I start? My first career was as a kindergarten teacher. And I got propelled into this area of international politics and law because of the nuclear threat. This was during the early 1980s when I was the first year kindergarten teacher. And there was the whole war that was at its height. The Soviet Union and the United States were threatening each other with nuclear weapons. Other countries were being caught up in the whole issue. New Zealand, we had been part of it for a long time. We still were at that time when I first started as a kindergarten teacher. We were hosting nuclear weapons coming in on US warships. We were part of this nuclear alliance to fight against the Soviet Union. But as a kindergarten teacher, I saw the risks of this, that by hosting these nuclear weapons coming to our ports on submarines, on warships, it wasn't really protecting us. It was making us a target. If a nuclear war break out, we would be a target. And to me, I don't want my school children, kindergarten children, to be blown up by nuclear weapons. But it wasn't even that, just that. It was even the preparation of nuclear weapons, the testing of them, the development of them was releasing huge amounts of radiation. And this radiation impacts women and children the most. In the Pacific, we had the experience of nuclear testing from the UK. They were tested in Australia and in Christmas Island, from the United States, testing in the Marshall Islands, from France, testing in French Polynesia. And the impact on the women and children, primarily, around the Pacific, has just been horrific. So many cases of cancers and deformed babies. So I saw this dual risk, of these weapons. If there was a nuclear war, it's game over. But the very fact of this nuclear arms race was already impacting people, including children. I had to do something about it. So I got involved in the campaign to ban nuclear weapons from our country, and we succeeded. In 1984, we brought in an anti-nuclear government. Immediately, the United States said we weren't allowed to be nuclear free. We had to accept the US nuclear warships because we were part of this military alliance called ANZUS. And we go, well, hold it. It doesn't say anything in that treaty that we have to accept your nuclear weapons. And so it was like a legal dispute. So we actually got advice from this wonderful, wonderful lawyer from the United States, Professor Richard Falk, who said, look, if there's a legal dispute like this, the International Court of Justice is the place to take it. And we go, what a great idea. We weren't so skeptical about the International Court of Justice as some people are, because we had seen good results from cases in the past. We'd seen 1974, the nuclear tests case, where New Zealand and Australia took France to the International Court of Justice over atmospheric testing. What happened thereafter? France stopped its atmospheric testing. We saw the Nicaragua case against the United States, because the United States was supporting the Contras and was mining the harbors and overthrowing, trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. The court case, which went in Nicaraguans' favor, helped pave the way for the Costa Rican peace accords. So we had seen, the value of taking a legal approach in a big dispute like this. So that's when I got involved, and sort of took a little bit of a hiatus from peace education, because I've been doing education not just in kindergartens, but also peace education in schools, and got involved in the campaign to take this issue to the International Court of Justice. We didn't want to just resolve the dispute between New Zealand and the United States. What we wanted to do was to show that nuclear weapons are wrong. It's not one government or the other government, but it's the nuclear weapons themselves, and that no one should have them, whether it's the Soviets or the Americans or whoever, now the Russians, or whoever. So that's when this idea of going to the court to take the issue of nuclear weapons themselves was so interesting to us. It's called an advisory opinion, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, because it's not really an advisory opinion. It's actually a real case in the court. But the UN Charter, or the Charter and the Charter, the Statute of the International Court of Justice, calls an advisory opinion to distinguish it from the other type of case, which is called a contentious case. A contentious case was what the nuclear weapons tests case was. Two countries, Australia and New Zealand, took France to the court for a particular behavior that country was doing, testing nuclear weapons in our part of the world. But this one, we wanted to say, hey, nuclear weapons are bad. And so that's why it fits the advisory opinion approach, which is where a body of the United Nations, like the Security Council or ECOSOC or UNICEF or the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, the UN General Assembly, there's about 11 bodies of the United Nations that are authorized to take cases to the International Court of Justice. And then the court decides whether or not it's going to hear the case and what its opinion will be. And we thought, yep, this is the best approach. So we started looking at, well, what are the best UN bodies to take the case? We knew the Security Council wouldn't, because we're taking a case against nuclear weapons, and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, that's China, France, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, they're all nuclear weapon states. They're all going to be against us. So that's body won't do it. Other ones, it wasn't really in their mandate. So the 2 that we chose was the World Health Assembly and the United Nations General Assembly. We were successful in both, but it was a very, very difficult task to get there. The World Health Assembly, we basically had to convince health ministers, from around the world, who are the ones responsible for health policy and representation of their governments in the World Health Organization, that this is something that the World Health Organization should do. And we were supported by the fact that the World Health Organization had actually undertaken a study. And their study on the impact if nuclear weapons are used. And their study was, look, if nuclear weapons are used today, it's quite different to when nuclear weapons were used in the Second World War. That was 2 small nuclear bombs against 2 cities. How many nuclear weapons were there in the 1990s? 30,000. And many of them 10 or 100 times more destructive than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki ones. So it's a totally different order of impact if nuclear weapons were used in the 1990s or even today than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the World Health Organization had indicated, look, there's nothing that medical professionals could do in the case of a nuclear war. And so the responsibility is to prevent. The other body was the UN General Assembly. And the UN General Assembly is an interesting body of the United Nations because every member country of the United Nations gets one vote. So China has one vote, which is however many billions, 1.5 billion people. Samoa gets one vote of 100,000 people. Nauru, of a population of 8,000 people, gets one vote. So it gives a much bigger voice to smaller countries around the world to ensure that their voices are heard. They're not drowned out by the big, powerful countries, which means that it's possible to get a majority in the UN General Assembly on an issue like this if you can persuade, more than half the 192 member states to take it forward. Well, we were able to do that in 1993. This is when we were starting. The issue was around the early 1990s. We were able to do this, but the problem is that the nuclear weapon states then started using their political clout to change the minds of most of the governments that we got on board. So in 2013, we had a resolution which was introduced to the United Nations, and then the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, even some of the allied countries like Germany and Italy were calling on their friends, the countries around the world, countries with that influence, giving threats. There were arms trade deals on the table. There was boycotts mentioned. So all sorts of political power. They forced most of the countries that were supporting us to drop back, and we lost it in 1993. So we actually had to find a group of countries that couldn't be blocked or pushed aside by the nuclear weapon states, and we found the non-aligned movement. It was a group of 105 countries, and working together as a bloc, they could resist the pressure. Individually, they could be picked apart, but as a bloc. So we went to the non-aligned summit. We found out I managed to get talk to the ambassador and managed to get invited to the non-aligned summit. And then at the non-aligned summit, we met with the ministers. We got them to adopt a resolution saying that the non-aligned movement as a whole would introduce this into the UN General Assembly. And once they did that, there was 105 countries already there, and it was too big a bloc. The decision was basically already made at the ministerial level at the summit, so that there was really nothing the nuclear weapon states could do to stop it anymore. They tried with various procedural measures at the United Nations General Assembly, but we managed to block those. So in 1994, we got the resolution adopted in the UN General Assembly to take the case to the International Court of Justice. Now, I mention all that because that's the way we can get a case into the court. We can't take it ourselves. Civil society doesn't have standing in the court. So we have to go to like-minded countries in the United Nations or get a country to take a contentious case. And as I mentioned, we wanted to take a case on the issue of nuclear weapons. So we got there into the court in 1994. And then the question is, what about winning the case? It's not necessarily that you win just because you get a case in the court. It's possible you could lose. And we have seen a nuclear weapons case in the court that was lost, where the Marshall Islands, which was one of the islands impacted by nuclear tests, tried to take the 9 nuclear weapon states to the International Court of Justice to challenge them that they weren't doing enough on their nuclear disarmament obligation. The court turned them down and said, sorry, this is not a genuine dispute between you and those 9 other countries. And then they dismissed it. This was a little bit later than our case. But anyway, you don't just necessarily win it just because you get the case in court. Now, there are 2 things to ensure that you win the case. One is the law. You have to have decent legal arguments. But the other is actually the way it's framed politically, because the judges on the court, although they are bound, to apply the law, most will come into a particular issue with some way that they're thinking about it, with a framing. And then if they've already sort of got a perspective on it, they will find the law to back up that perspective. and they'll sort of elevate that law, and the law that opposes their perspective, they go, oh, that's not so important. So the political framing of this is as important as the law. And that's why, I realized that once we got the case to the court, my job wasn't done. The lawyers were going to take, because I wasn't a lawyer, the lawyers would come in and provide the legal arguments, but I had to make sure that it was framed correctly, and that the judges of the court saw it as something that was relevant for them to find against nuclear weapons. Now, how to do that? Firstly, was to make sure that we got as many countries appearing in the court as possible. We can't appear ourselves, but countries can, members of the United Nations. And so that's what a campaign we did. And I was going around capitals, like encouraging governments to turn up in the court. And we managed to get the most countries participating in a court case in the history of the International Court of Justice. The second thing, though, is that how is it presented in the oral hearings? Basically, the process is that countries can write a written submission to the court, and then there'll be oral hearings, and they give an oral hearings. And then after the oral hearings, the court then sort of goes, the judges go away and they spend however amount of time going over the written and the oral, submissions and the oral submissions, and come up with their conclusion. Now, the oral hearings are very important. If you have, like the countries that are like the final speakers, the ones that get the final say, have got the upper hand. They are the ones who can like answer whatever's been said before, and then give, opposition to it or put other arguments. So when we found out, the list of countries that were appearing before the court, they were listed alphabetically. And I called up the registrar of the court and I said, so you've got the list of the countries, what's the order they appear in? And the registrar said alphabetical. And the list ended with the United Kingdom and the United States. And I'm going, oh dear, the two final countries, they will get the whole afternoon of the last day of the hearings to say how nuclear weapons are so important for peace, and how they prevent aggression, and how you don't have to worry, they're managed very well, they're not for using, they're just for preventing use, and all the arguments they put forward to justify their nuclear weapons. And we won't have any chance to answer them. So I call up the registrar again and said, is it too late, for a country to come in for the oral hearings? And the registrar said, no, they've still got probably another 8 days until we start. So we had 8 days to come up with, what's a country in the alphabet that comes after United States that might be interested in coming? And we were thinking, Vanuatu, have been very good in the non-proliferation treaty, but Vanuatu had just change of government. It was the Francophones, and they weren't going to oppose France. There was Venezuela, but Venezuela, the ambassador had just been dumped because he'd been too strongly anti-nuclear and annoyed others. There was Zaire, but they were in a civil war. And there was Zimbabwe. And now this was, I think, before Mugabe had gone mad. And Mugabe had actually, in the early times of Zimbabwe, had done quite well in building the country once it had become the shift in government from the apartheid Rhodesian government to a non-apartheid government. The beginnings was actually okay, and they had a good government. Their Attorney General, Nathan Shamurira, was fantastic, actually studied under one of our lawyers. So we already had an in with Zimbabwe. So we had a couple of days to try and get Zimbabwe to agree to turn up in the court. And we managed to do that again just because I knew someone who knew Mugabe, and we were able to again get a ticket to the NAM summit, which was happening that week in Colombia. So I quickly flew down to Colombia, took my colleague down. We managed to get an audience with with Mugabe. He said yes, and so 2 weeks later, I was in The Hague with the Zimbabwe ambassador from Brussels, briefing him about what Zimbabwe should do in the hearings. So we got the final say, which was great. We were able then to come after the United States and the United Kingdom and answer their arguments. So that was one of the things. The other key thing, though, was to shape, the fact that nuclear weapons today are very different from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We needed to do that because if you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, it was horrific. the destruction. But those cities have rebuilt. Japan was not destroyed by those two nuclear bombs. Japan has rebuilt. So if you're just thinking about, the experience of the use of nuclear weapons and war will be like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then it's not really that bad. I mean, it's bad, but it's not that bad. The reality, though, of nuclear weapons today is, as I said, is so much different from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we needed to have some testimony, some expertise from that. So we got survivors from nuclear testing from the Marshall Islands, one of the places, with the nuclear testing. And there, what their testimony was, even in peacetime, when you detonated these big nuclear bombs, because these are bigger ones, these are 100,000 times bigger than the ones from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even in peaceful times, when you detonate these 100 miles away from any population, the impact on human is horrific, transgenerational. It lasts into the future. We are still having deformed babies, and we'll have deformed babies for years. The woman who we brought to the court from the Marshall Islands, it took her 3 days to get there, because to get from Marshall Islands to The Hague is so difficult. But she testified in front of the judges that she had 8 miscarriages. She wasn't able to give birth to a live baby. Some of the babies that were being born in Marshall Islands looked like jellyfish. They looked like bunches of grapes. They were just horribly deformed. And this was the horror of what a small part of a nuclear war might be. Just imagine a real nuclear war. And I think it was their testimony from the Marshall Islands, plus the fact that we had so many countries turn up, plus the fact that we had the one right at the end, we can answer the US and UK, meant that we were able to win that case. Because the judges, 8 of the 14, the majority, were from nuclear armed and allied states. So the odds were stacked up against us going into the court, but we managed to get that through. So the court came out with quite an amazing conclusion. The threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal under existing international law, laws governing what you can and can't do in warfare, and also law about going to war, laws of peace and security, the UN Charter. That the use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic, and the destructive impact could not be contained in time nor space. This was an incredible conclusion. The destructive impact of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in time nor space. So just imagine that. It actually violates the whole fundamentals of law, which is to ensure that you have an existing society. This transcends all that. So this was a fundamental conclusion of the court. Therefore, the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal. There's an obligation of states to negotiate for their elimination. The court didn't come down 100%. They said, we can't determine that nuclear weapons, the use would necessarily be illegal in every circumstance, because we don't know the nature of every single nuclear weapon. There could possibly be a small nuclear weapon detonated a long way away from a population, that might just be targeted at military facilities, that might possibly not violate law. But that's not the purpose of nuclear weapons. The purpose of nuclear weapons is massive destruction. That's their rationale. So the court was actually demolishing any legality for the purpose of nuclear weapons. So we got a fantastic decision from the court, but now what impact has it had? The court itself doesn't have its own police force. It basically decides this is what the law is, and then it's up to the international community to take that forward. One would hope that the UN Security Council would take it forward, but not in this case, because of the 5 nuclear weapon states. So how is it taken forward? In a number of different ways. One way is that it actually impacts on the military planners and the legal advisors to the military planners in the nuclear weapon states. Prior to this, there was no official determination of what is the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. So they were sort of guided more by military purpose, and political purpose than by the laws of warfare. After the decision from the court, it actually put basically the spanner in the works of a lot of the military planning on nuclear weapons. It didn't stop it. We still see nuclear weapons are still being produced. They're still part of the doctrines of the nuclear weapon states, but it actually put like something into the works. So for example, in Russia, the nuclear policy that came out immediately after the decision from the court actually took words from the conclusion of the court that said, the Russian nuclear weapons, their purpose is to protect the very survival of the state of Russia. So that's a constraining of the role of nuclear weapons. We have seen this now shift because of the politics, and the tensions between Russia and the United States. In the United States, we've now seen that the military planners are actually thinking about what are legal or non-legal uses of nuclear weapons. And we saw that in Senate Foreign Affairs Committee hearings, on presidential authority to use nuclear weapons in 2017, just a few years ago. The head of the nuclear command, was basically saying, if the president asked us to conduct an illegal act of nuclear weapons, we would have to say, sorry, Mr. President, that's illegal. So they're actually thinking about it. And the UK, immediately after the decision of the court, started a program on what would it take to verify the elimination of nuclear weapons using some of the expertise from their weapons manufacturing laboratories. So there was some development there. I think it's strengthened the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, but it hasn't been strong enough to counter the political adherence to nuclear deterrence, which is still incredibly strong, in both the United Nations system, in the Security Council, and globally. It has given a lot of support to civil society activists who have used the case in court hearings, some being successful. A Scottish judge acquitted some 3 activists who went in and did physical damage in a nuclear facility up in Scotland. And the judge said it's because these are illegal systems based on the court hearing. And it's given support for like-minded countries to take forward nuclear disarmament initiatives. One of the most recent one we've seen is them negotiating a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states haven't joined it, nor have the allies, but it's given some strength to these initiatives. And it's inspired this new campaign to take the issue of climate change to the International Court of Justice in order to bring the force of international law to bear on the responsibility to protect current and future generations, and that responsibility has to come up the front. Economics shouldn't be at the front of this. Political expediency shouldn't be at the front. The responsibility of international law to protect current and future generations, which was part of the nuclear weapons case, will be brought to the fore if we can get the climate issue to the International Court of Justice. So to me, it's been inspiring. There are many, many other stories I could tell about behind the scenes and things, and how we managed to sort of subvert the powerful countries of the world. It shows it's possible to do it. That law has a role. It's not the final answer. There's a lot of other interplay, but civil society can do this, and you don't have to be a legal expert. I started this before I knew much about international law. I learned a lot taking it forward, but anyone can get involved in this because the law is basically there for us. It's not there for the powerful. It's there to provide equality, equity, and that's why it's a tool for civil society for us to use. So thank you very much for this opportunity to give a little bit of the background and the process for this exciting case we took against nuclear weapons.
Alyn, that was absolutely fantastic. Your summary of such a lot of very complex issues and was just really wonderful to hear. We really appreciate the work that you've done really to save humanity from the scourge of nuclear weapons, and your time today telling us this story. Thank you so much, and best of luck to you as you continue this peace education work. Thank you.
And good luck with the climate change issue before the ICJ as well. There isn't a higher calling in international environmental law these days. Thank you so much, Alyn.
Thank you.